Welcome to the Healing Collective Live, where we help you heal from those unhealed, wounded places, be it physical, mental, or spiritually. Today we have our special guest, Tamra Sori, and I am so glad to have her here. Today we're going to be talking about trauma and those things that even in adulthood that cause us to stay stuck, stay frozen. And I am so glad that I have the expert here to discuss those things with me. Tamra, how are you doing? How's it going? What's going on with you? Let's talk.
First of all, thank you for inviting me to your inaugural podcast. Congratulations
Thank
to
you.
you. I am doing well. I'm just happy about life, glad to be here. Things are going well. So, yeah, all is good.
Okay, all is good. Like hearing that. I've talked to some other therapists and other people in the field, but tell me your take on trauma.
So, my take on trauma is that we have all experienced trauma in some sort of way. There are what's known as big T traumas, which are those significant life altering traumatic experiences, maybe like just as an example, a child that maybe almost drowned on a family trip to the beach. That's a big T trauma. Small T trauma may be something for some individuals, and again, this is just an example, could be something maybe like bullying. And I use that as a small T trauma example. Of course, that is very subjective, but I use it as my own as an example because it wasn't until I became an adult that I realized that I was bullied in middle school. But when I reflected on that, it wasn't something that really bothered me as much, and it didn't really impact my ability to make friends as I continue to, of course, progress through middle and high school. So with that, just that example, my take on trauma is that we've all experienced trauma. Some
Okay.
of those traumas are unresolved traumas. Some of those are resolved. And there's even something known as trauma resilience. So maybe that bullying example for myself is maybe an example of trauma resilience, meaning that it happened to me. It hurt a little bit. I was able to bounce back from it. Didn't really impact me that much. And I was able to just move on in my life. Yeah.
Okay. So you mentioned the big T trauma would be
Hmm.
almost drowning, and the little
Yeah.
T trauma would be being bullied in high school or middle school, but not recognizing that you were bullying. What's the real difference though? So if you're
Hmm.
drowning
Hmm.
and you're fighting for your life, but you're in middle school and high school and you don't recognize that you're being bullied, would it be
Hmm.
different if you recognize that you were being bullied? I'm just trying to understand,
Yeah.
why
I
is it a
mean,
big T, little T? And what's the
well,
significant? I'm
yeah.
sorry, go ahead.
No, you're fine. So I use that particular small T trauma just for myself. We could even say maybe a small T trauma is growing up as a child, you're told don't touch that stove, it's hot. And you touch it, and as soon as you touch it, you notice that it's hot, and so you automatically draw back from that stove. That was a small T trauma, meaning that your brain communicated with you that that was danger. And so
Uh-huh.
moving forward, you now know I have to be cautious. I have to make sure that that stove is not hot. Now, to answer your question, just around the difference between noticing that you were bullied versus not noticing it, it could have just been how my bully bullied me. And maybe it just didn't matter to me. Maybe it hurt my feelings a little bit, but because I had other healthy friendships, it didn't bother me as much. So I definitely just want to, make sure just for understanding purposes that bullying can definitely be a big T trauma. A lot of times traumatic experiences just depends on if that particular experience is it poses as a threat, it's a significant life altering event for you. But that child is being bullied, and it's impacting their grades, it's impacting their ability to function. They're constantly operating in fear.
Okay.
Then of course that's a big T trauma. Those things were never an issue for me. when I reflected back on that, it just didn't, I guess, bother me as much. Yeah. And you think you asked a question about the drowning part. So that can be
Right.
traumatic, of course, if a child, if they can't, of course, swim, maybe they've been carried by like a current in the ocean, they can't swim, they're panicked, they're trying to save themselves. Um,
Hmm.
they almost die. So of course that
Right.
is definitely a traumatic experience, for the child. Yeah.
What depends or what makes the healing possible? I almost died. I did die
Mhm. Mhm.
in the drowning and, I made it through. What would constitute that I have been healed from that traumatic experience? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
How,
Yeah, definitely. So when we talk about or when we look at traumatic experiences, so our focus, of course, will be like the big T traumas, right? The ones that significantly impact our lives. Our body records those traumatic experiences. Our brain records those traumatic experiences as they're happening, as they are occurring, just as the brain records positive experiences as well. But
okay.
for the example of the I almost drowned experience, how do you know that person is healed? Perhaps they can now go to the beach and they're not afraid to get in the ocean. They remember that experience happened, but I'm assuming if they participated in some type of trauma therapy,
Hmm.
they have worked through the autonomic responses that occurs when their brain reminds them of that traumatic experience. It could be the sound of the ocean that doesn't bother them anymore. So it really depends on how they respond when they are re-exposed to circumstances that were related to that traumatic experience. Yeah.
Okay.
Mhm.
So you know that they're healed, like you just said, because now they can face the ocean. You know, they can actually put their feet, their body in the ocean.
Mhm.
So that is a resolved trauma. How does it
Mhm.
show up when and we keep going back to the analogy with the going to the beach. But when you think about other traumas, how does it show up in our adult life where you see a person or you met a client who's come to you and they can't figure out what's going on? And as you dig deeper, you realize that it is some unhealed wounding that has occurred or is in their bodies that's preventing them from moving forward. So how does that normally show up?
So that it typically always shows up as either anxiety, most of the time anxiety and depression, but typically it's always anxiety. Maybe sometimes it's anger. I'm always angry. I can't control my anger. People just piss me off. They make me mad. But most of the time it usually shows up as anxiety. I'm always anxious. I can't sleep. I'm always nervous. Always having panic attacks. I thought I was having a heart attack. My palms are always sweaty. My mouth gets dry. I'm always looking behind me. I'm always afraid that something bad is going to happen, but I can't really figure out what that bad is. And so when we dig deep, there are a lot of questions that we ask. And we do start with childhood, but it's not necessarily a tell me about your childhood. It's usually a
What
questionnaire.
is it?
Yeah.
You
It's
don't
not tell
approach
me
it
about your
that way.
childhood.
Uh-huh.
It's not it doesn't usually because sometimes people will say, "Well, my childhood was fine." And you ask more questions in unique ways. And as they begin to share, they either one, they become self-aware, or secondly, as a therapist, we begin to point those things out. There's also not to be too therapeutic, I guess, in my terms, but there is a questionnaire, and actually, I think anybody can Google this and answer the questions. But there's a questionnaire, it's an assessment, and it's called the Adverse Childhood Event Assessment. And it's called the ACE for short, ACE. And the ACE asks questions about your childhood. And I think it's yes or no questions. One of the questions is, hey, when I was a child, I had a parent or a caregiver that cursed at me. When I was a child, I had a parent or caregiver that touched me inappropriately. When I was a child, I had a parent or a caregiver that drank alcohol excessively. So it asks those questions, and it's so helpful as a therapist to have clients answer that, because it does begin to unlock the door to some possible traumatic experiences that that person may have endured that could be connected presently to their anxious anxiety symptoms. So yeah, they typically think it's like surface, but it's typically so
Mhm.
much deeper than it.
And you said possible because asking those questions don't always unlock that place.
Mean that that person experienced trauma in their childhood. It does
Uh-huh.
not mean that. It could mean that maybe they experienced trauma later on in their life, but we as therapists, we want to go back. We want to go as far back as we can so that we can identify what's the source, what's the foundation, when exactly did this start. So if we can go back as early as possible,
Mhm.
that's helpful for not only us as a therapist, but for the client as well, because we want them to be educated and informed as well. Yeah.
That's good. That's good. Now, do you notice any patterns from the people who have this unresolved trauma operating in their bodies? As a therapist, do you even notice any physical? I know you said depression, anxiety. Have you seen any cases where people have actually had hives or,
Oh,
loss of eyesight that's unexplained? Or can you talk a little bit about that?
that is a really good question. So yes, and we do tend to focus on like the emotional like symptoms
Right.
and the behavioral symptoms. But yes, there can be physical symptoms as well. Yes, yes. Hives, definitely. I had a client who experienced chronic hives. Their particular were honestly connected to the lack of or the estranged relationship that they had with one of their parents from childhood. Their hypertension. Yep. So hypertension, thyroid issues that I have seen in some of my female clients. So yes, definitely, because trauma is stored in the body, it can definitely create health problems. And typically, when a client presents to therapy, maybe usually in the first or second session, I always ask them, when was the last time you had a primary care visit where you've had blood work done? If you just had like a complete physical exam, because of course some things are organic, they are based on medical conditions, but a lot of times those medical conditions can be a result of secondary to our trauma, post-traumatic stress, I'll say that post-traumatic
Mhm.
stress disorder that we have. So yeah, there are definitely some medical complications on stomach ulcers from being nervous and anxious all the time. Yeah, definitely for sure. Yeah. So trauma doesn't just impact the mental, it's physiological for sure. Definitely. Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Mhm.
Now, have you noticed in terms of people who have gone, and you said we all have gone through some amount of trauma, be it at the big T or
Mhm.
the little t, but have you
Mhm.
noticed in terms of relationships, people who have suffered through some of the big, especially emotional traumas like abuse and misuse and stuff like that, have you noticed how their trust level? Have you noticed how they interact in terms of how they trust people or if they trust people?
Yeah. So for those individuals that like maybe perhaps experience child abuse, like physical child abuse, verbal, sexual, of course, abuse. As a child, of course, again, we go back to core memories, right? So as children, when we experience significant things that happen in our lives, positive or negative, speaking negatively, we develop these core beliefs about the world, about systems, and about people. And for the child that has maybe been, we'll just use physical abuse, physical and emotional abuse, for example. A lot of times, those particular individuals, if they have not received trauma therapy, so they have unresolved childhood trauma, it definitely can impact their relationship. Now, we often think that the trust is that they don't trust, but sometimes the unresolved traumatic experience in an adult can look like someone that trusts too much. They don't see the red flags.
Okay,
Yeah.
let's
hmm
talk about that.
Yeah.
Someone who trusts too
hmm
much, who has gone under, who is the unresolved, and I know I got to cut that part out because I'm stuttering, but the
It's okay.
unresolved trauma, it can show up in ways where they trust too much. Talk,
Yeah.
explain that.
They, yeah. So they allow themselves to be extremely vulnerable. They want to be loved. They desire to be loved because it's not something that they received during their childhood. And so it looks like someone who necessarily wasn't someone that looks like or behaves like their abuser, but it does not mean that the the other partner does not use that as an opportunity to be manipulative, to take control or advantage of that person. So, too trusting, meaning that they immediately automatically just open up or accept people no matter how they present. They don't see the red flag. They want to be loved so bad that subconsciously they're willing to put themselves out there. And so being trusting, meaning they don't see the red flags, they give passes to that person, they allow themselves to be vulnerable like too soon, or they want to move too quickly. They're ready to be in something too quickly. Or it could be the
Very
complete
impulsive.
opposite.
Okay.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Or it could be the complete opposite. So there's something known as attachment style when it comes to
Okay.
relationships. And so that kind of also helps to explain the behaviors of individuals who may have unresolved childhood trauma and how it looks in their relationships with others. So there's something known as anxious attachment. So an anxious attachment, this person, the abused child that's now an adult that has unresolved trauma, that person presents as someone that has a negative view of themselves, but a positive view of their partner. And because they have this negative view of themselves, that shows up. What that looks like is low self-esteem, low self-confidence, low self-worth, but they glorify their partner. And so their partner is seen as like their literally their better half, meaning their partner can't do any wrong. So much so they have a fear, they're anxious that their partner will leave them or that they're not good enough for their partner. So they have this intense fear that their partner will leave them. That's anxious attachment. Then you have the avoidant attachment. The avoidant attachment is maybe the child that was maybe sexually abused, or children are vulnerable, right? They trust everybody.
Right.
But
Right.
when we become adults, based on those traumatic experiences that occurred when if they're unresolved, what that looks like in relationships is that the avoidant person is the person that has a positive self view of themselves and a
Mm-hmm.
negative self view of their partner. So they may be the highly confident person. They're the person that is super independent. I don't need anybody to take care of me. I don't want to, and this is all typically subconscious. Um,
Right.
They see it as, for them, it's normal to not want to have these emotional bonds and connections with people. And so I'm going to avoid that, because if I avoid it, then I won't get hurt. And then you have the secure attachment, which is the person that, whether they experience childhood trauma or not, but they work through that, they are very secure in their relationships. They feel balanced, they feel whole, the
Uh,
partner feels the same. So that just shows up as like a very healthy relationship. So a lot of times when we experience, or when a person experiences childhood trauma, if it's unresolved, the way that it impacts their relationships, the way that it impacts their relationships can show up in one of those attachment styles: anxious attachment, avoidant attachment. So kind of, it can show up in those sorts of ways.
Thank
Yeah.
you for that.
Mhm. You're
Now, for
welcome. Yeah.
someone who has recognized that they do have this unresolved
Yeah.
trauma that they do want to heal, what would be some of the first steps
Well,
and to begin to
definitely.
heal from this childhood trauma?
Yeah, I would definitely say be open to meeting with a therapist, someone that you trust, of course, someone that you feel like you can be vulnerable with. If you have a friend or partner that you do trust completely, express that to them so that they can be that extra layer of support that you need as you seek out counseling. To heal from these traumatic experiences. So I would definitely say the first step is, after you acknowledge, something isn't right. I know that this is something that I need to work through. It is impacting my relationship. It's impacting my friendships. It's impacting my work. It's impacting just me internally as a person. I'm tired of being like the yes man. I want to set boundaries. I want to say no, but I don't know how to. So definitely individual counseling, I believe, would be the first approach that one should take when they recognize that they want to process and heal from their traumatic experience. Yeah.
I appreciate you that you keep saying when they recognize it, because
Hmm.
I think one of the first steps is becoming aware that there's an issue,
Hmm.
that there's a problem. I think about trauma as, like, for some of us, we're stinking and we don't even realize it, because
Hmm.
you know how you have a wound and it's infected
Hmm.
and pus is going all over the place, and you're just going along. You know you have this wound. You're hoping no one
Hmm.
else notices it, but people are noticing it because you're just kind of bleeding all over the place, because you have this
Yeah.
unresolved trauma. This place in you that needs to be healed. So thank you for
Hmm.
just making that point, that when you recognize, because too many people are walking around with unresolved trauma and they don't realize it because they are not
Hmm.
aware that, yeah, it's an issue. Your life could be
Yeah.
so much better if you attend to this sore. So thank you for
Yeah.
that. Now, in terms of support systems, and for
Hmm.
those who say, nope, I will not do therapy, but I will work on myself, what would you suggest? Are there some tools for the individual who said, you know what, I can heal myself?
Well, okay. Yeah. If, a person wants to take that approach, at least,
Hmm.
you got to start somewhere. And if that's, if that's what they
Gotta
want to
start.
do, yeah. Yeah. So it is so important. I say, first and foremost,
Say
you gotta
what you want to say,
educate
Tamara.
yourself. Okay, so what I was basically saying is, you had asked a question, someone that refuses to go to counseling, and they just want to
Hmm.
do this themselves. What can they do? So, first and foremost, like I stated, reading about trauma and how it impacts the body. I would say start with educating oneself on what trauma is. Secondly, most educating yourself by, of course, reading a book that's specific to trauma.
Hmm.
There's another a resource that just popped up in my head. It's the National Childhood Trauma Network, I think.
Mhm.
that gives information about childhood trauma. And I, honestly would say that I would probably just educate that person a little bit more on the benefits of working through your trauma experiences under the guidance of a trained professional. Because the last thing that you want to do is try to reprocess your own trauma without being, of course, guided by someone that's trained, that's trauma informed, trained in that sort of topic. But I mean, it definitely doesn't hurt a person to educate themselves. I would also say maybe reach out, connect with someone, find a peer that
Mhm.
perhaps
Mhm.
has completed trauma therapy so that you can get that person's feedback on what their experience has been. Maybe that'll open up that person's mind
Mhm.
to being open up their mind to maybe perhaps considering it if they maybe have spoken with someone. But I just would not suggest working on it yourself. Yeah.
It's not a solo project. What do you think about the community? People who, and we all have a person, and we may even be that person in our family where they have gone through some stuff. They have experienced some trauma and they're sort of acting out. How do we support that person without cutting them off? I think about even in my own family, those who have some serious addictions, but those addictions were first introduced because of some trauma. So they were just trying to numb themselves in order to escape or to what they figured heal from that trauma. So how can I or we be more supportive to that person because they're just causing all kind of issues? So how can the community
Yeah.
help someone that we know they're hurting? They don't
Yeah.
want to seek help, but they're hurting so much that they're starting to hurt the community. How do we
Mhm.
help them?
Yeah. So, you mentioned that you have, family members that suffered from things like addiction and, so have I. I'm thinking of a family member in particular that's younger than I am, and they suffered a lot as a child that we didn't know about. Um, and when that person became an adult, we definitely saw someone different that for me, I felt uncomfortable around that person, loved them, but just felt uncomfortable because their behaviors, I'm laughing at myself. Their behaviors were unpredictable. But as I became older and a mental health clinician and learned about trauma and substance abuse, I saw this person from a different lens and began to. I never treated them like they didn't belong. Just more so, I operated in fear around when I was around them, and so I think it's so important that family community understands that oftentimes they're not. They didn't choose this because they just wanted to try something. You said it earlier. They chose this form of maladaptive coping because it was probably what they saw growing up. It was probably they probably saw their parent or guardian turn to alcohol to cope. They probably saw their parent or guardian engage in drugs to cope. Sometimes, sadly, our caregivers or parents give us the alcohol or the drug to put us to sleep so that they can have a good time, so that they don't have to parent the child. So it didn't start with them. And it's so important that as a community, we first and foremost understand what alcohol abuse is, what substance abuse is, how it happens, situations that typically drive a person to that. And we
Mhm.
support them by having the knowledge. Once we have the
Mhm.
knowledge, then we can maybe ask, "Hey, what happened to you?" I don't
Okay.
know if I've seen this a lot. I've heard it a lot. We probably all experienced it. We typically ask, "What's wrong with you?" There's nothing wrong with any of us. It's what we
Oh, I
have
like that.
experienced in our lives. So, what? Hey, what happened to you? Like, as a non-therapist, I probably would be willing
Mhm.
to say, I remember when you were like such and such as a kid. Like, and then like, I remember you were like this, vibrant, happy person, and then all of a sudden, like, I just noticed, like, these were some of the changes that I saw, like, what happened? But really
Mm,
coming in with, like, a genuine approach. So I think family, community, we have to first and foremost have knowledge, and then we have to be mature enough to approach that person to hear their story, because everybody has one.
mm,
And you may be the first person to ever ask them that type of question to where it's genuine and you truly want to hear their story. You may be the person that urges them or pushes them to want to get help. And so,
right.
family and community, I think, again, just having that knowledge, the willingness, the openness to accept people as they are, meet them where they are, but
Mm,
also, I think we all have value. We all have something that we can give, and just reminding that person, hey, you're still a valuable asset.
mm.
The person I'm thinking of in particular, we have always looked forward to seeing them unhealed and healed, now healed, thankfully so healed, and I just love it.
That was going to be my
They
next question, the success
yeah,
story with this person. So,
yeah. Yeah, yeah. My relative never lost their sense of humor, but totally shows up as a different person. You just see it. You physically see it. They just look different. Yeah, just being supportive, I think, is what it comes down to.
being supportive.
Uh-huh.
And I like the fact that you said ask it, being mature enough to ask the right questions. And also being willing to hear the answer, I think is also
Uh-huh.
another
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
critical. Sometimes we don't want to hear the truth. What's that
Uh-huh.
movie? You can't
Uh-huh.
handle the
Yeah.
truth. And for some
Oh yeah.
people, especially when it comes to our families, we don't want to hear the truth. We don't want to hear that grandpa or granddaddy actually touched little
Uh-huh.
Johnny or little Megan or whoever. We don't want to hear that. We just
Uh-huh.
want to keep going on and hope that it will
Uh-huh.
fix itself.
Yeah.
But in my experience, trauma does not fix itself, and rarely does a person can they heal themselves by themselves. And so that's
Yeah.
why I am so big on the healing collective.live and even our work in wombs coming together and say, let us work together. Let's have a safe space in place where we can heal.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And you're right. Trauma does not fix itself. I was actually having a conversation with someone earlier this week, but they have a relative that's in their very old age that is passing away. And in their passing away, they're talking about their childhood trauma. And I just think it's so sad. I just think it's so sad.
It is
So,
sad.
yeah. Yeah. So it
It
is
is
definitely.
sad. And to me, that they never felt like they had a place to say, I can't carry this anymore. This
Mhm.
has hurt me. Yes, I've done some tremendous things because even those of us we've gone through school, we've got our degrees, we got all of this junk and stuff, but in some cases, we still have that big T trauma that
Mhm.
needs to heal. That's
Mhm.
keeping us from fully going on to bigger and better. And even the
Yeah.
person that you referred to who is up in age and now they're talking about it. I
Mhm.
imagine how their lives would have been if they had talked about it even earlier. But
Mhm.
sometimes we're afraid, we don't have the place, and we
Mhm.
don't feel like we have the space to share and say, this is what has happened to me. This is what I'm going through. How
Mhm.
can I heal?
Yeah. Yeah. Very true. Very much so true.
Just
Yeah.
a couple more questions, but
Yeah.
this podcast is geared towards women
Mhm.
specifically.
Mhm.
So when you think about women, because I know the unresolved trauma, it comes out, it looks different for men and women.
Mhm.
What's your take on that? Do you notice it being a difference, or to you it is just they show up all the same?
Well, I think it depends on, what the traumatic experience was. So,
Mm-hmm.
we can just use the example of child abuse.
Okay.
Most of the time, men who experience maybe child abuse, they were or had a parent that was excessively violent towards them, or of course, if they witnessed family violence, they tend to show up as abusers in their adult lives, while women who have experienced the same type of abuse as a child, they're typically not violent towards men or women. They are typically attracting men who are physically abusive, and that is because that's a learned behavior. That's a trauma behavior. They're still operating on a trauma brain. So not a traumatic brain injury, but a trauma brain
Gotcha.
that's been unresolved. So it really, in my professional opinion, it depends on what the traumatic experience was. Typically, men are extremely angry. Women, not so much. We're usually depressed, anxious. Yeah. So I would say it's different depending on, again, the traumatic experience that occurred. But the similarity still, though, is that both are in these unhealthy relationships. So that's a similarity. They're still both in unhealthy relationships, because an abuser is with a woman, right, who has unresolved trauma. And she may be that woman that has that anxious attachment style, or that, so they got that anxious attachment style, negative view of self, but positive view of this person that is physically abusing her, afraid and unable to leave. Yeah.
You said unable to leave. You mean physically
Unwilling.
or
Unwilling. Well, and domestic violence is a whole topic in itself.
in and of
Sometimes
itself? Yes.
sometimes unwilling, sometimes unable, sometimes afraid, sometimes financially just not able to, sometimes not willing to for the safety of the children. So it's a lot of reasons. But again, all reasons why that woman, and I should say that woman, all reasons why the person that is in the abused relationship, the abuse, should seek counseling, because they don't feel empowered. They don't feel safe. They feel like they are stuck. And that's not true. But it is also important to not judge those individuals, because they're not staying because they simply want to. There's something that's not unresolved that they need to work on. Yeah.
And it kind of goes back to what we said earlier. If they have the want to, if they have become aware that there's an issue, and then they make the choice to move forward. And it's hard. And it's not something that's just, we on the outside looking in, we think it's just straightforward. But I think it's a very complex situation when you're talking about trauma in relationships, especially in relationships in terms of a partnership or a romantic involvement, that you have that unresolved trauma. You've attached yourself to someone who is just like the abuser, and you're not even aware. But then when you become aware, you're trying to figure out how to tease away from this person. And it is complex. On the outside looking in, you look at women and men, because men are also involved in those abusive situations, but you look at them and you say, why don't you just leave? Or and it's not just as easy as we on the outside think that it is.
It's not.
Not at all.
For a married couple that's been together for quite some time and they're just unhappy, there's no abuse that exists, but they're not happy, and they don't want to be together, they find it hard to leave. And so how much more then is it difficult for this woman that's vulnerable, or this man that's vulnerable? Some of those same attachments that's in a healthy marriage present in unhealthy marriages, like financial attachments, children. It makes it hard for them to leave, because it impacts not just the person that's leaving or the one, it affects the children, it affects the entire family as a whole. So yeah.
Thank you so much for that.
You're welcome.
One piece of advice you would give to every woman specifically, but every person that are in the process, because I believe we're all in process of healing from our trauma. What's one piece of advice you would give the person who are maybe in process healing from trauma?
Let's say bet on yourself, meaning
Mm,
prioritize yourself,
I
put
like that,
yourself
Jammer.
first. Yeah, bet on yourself. Take that risk. Like, what do you have honestly nothing to lose, but so much to gain if you just take that risk, go to therapy, and get what you need. The first couple of sessions, you'll probably walk out not feeling so great. But if you continue to bet on yourself and you keep going, it's going to get better. I promise you, I guarantee it. And I don't say that based on my training. I say that based on what I have seen walk in my office and what they look like walking out. Bet on yourself. It doesn't happen overnight. It is going to take time. It literally takes time. The same way we grow and develop from the moment that we're born, it takes the same amount of time, or you have to have that same amount of patience at least. I'm not going to say it doesn't take 18 years to heal trauma, but it takes
Right.
time. And that's why you have to bet on yourself, because when you bet on yourself, you're investing in yourself. You're saying, hey, I know I'm going to win. I know I'm going to make it, but it's not going to be easy, but it's definitely possible.
Hmm.
So that would definitely be my advice.
Do you
Yeah.
think,
Mhm.
okay, so would you give that same advice to a Christian woman who, where in the body or in the church, we have been taught that we should not be selfish. And even some have been taught that our bodies are not our own. So,
Mm,
how would that advice, and when I say that, the verse that talks about the man belongs to the woman belongs to the man. So, our bodies are not our own because we are one. So, how would that advice, I mean, I guess you can't answer for that person, but how would you convey that bet on yourself advice to a person who has been taught since childhood that they should be selfless instead of selfish?
I actually had a client that struggled with what you just mentioned, not specifically in that way, but the verse that came to my mind, even as you were asking, is one of the commandments: love thy neighbor as thyself. And when I think of that, I think that if I have to love my neighbor as myself, how can I love my neighbor unless I love myself first? So, in my Christian opinion, first and foremost, and then my therapeutic opinion, it's the same. How can you pour? You can't pour from an empty cup. So I have to love myself first before I can spread that love to others. What good am I to others if I'm not loving myself first? And when I love myself first, then I can help other people. And to me, that's selfless. So that's how I see that.
A part that I think is very critical, and it's that spiritual component
Hmm.
that for many of us who have been in the church or who grew up in the Bible Belt,
Hmm.
where women are taught to give, 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 and be selfless versus selfish in terms of their time, their bodies, their energies. We have been taught to
Hmm.
serve as much as possible
Hmm.
other people. I can even remember when I first got married, my aunt was like, "You're not gonna fix your husband's plate?" And I was thinking, "But he can fix his own." But that was the norm, to serve, our spouses and our children first versus taking care of ourselves. And you were speaking about a client of yours who was going through some of that. You want to continue with that conversation?
Yeah, she was having a difficult time putting herself first. Christian woman, but she was having a difficult time putting herself first. And literally, and I truly believe it was the Holy Spirit that told me to speak this to her, because it came to me so clearly. I didn't have to search for it. It just came to me the same way it came to me when you were speaking about it earlier. And one of the commandments that God gave us was to love thy neighbor as thyself. And when I think about that commandment, love thy neighbor as thyself, what he's telling us is the same way you love you, you have to love your neighbor. I don't know how to love my neighbor until I learn how to love myself first. And so it is important that I love myself first, meaning I take care of myself, I self prioritize, and that can maybe for some people that can be viewed as selfish, and that's okay. We as women have to say, okay, well, that's fine. If that's how you see it, then I'm going to be selfish today and I'm going to take care of myself so that the next time you need me, I can show up for you. Um, so that's what I think about. I think, okay, God, if you want me to love my neighbor as myself, then what that means is that I have to love myself. How I interpret that is that before I can help others, I have to take care of self first. So
Mhm.
always important to do that. Yeah.
Too often we give out of an empty cup
Yeah.
or out of a half full cup. We can barely get by, we can barely hang on, but we still find ourselves trying to give, give, give.
And then we feel depleted. And then the question is, well, who's taking care of you? I've just seen some comedy around, like a mom who just looks like she's almost on death's bed because she's so tired. And like all like it's like a cartoon of like the kids pulling on her and like the husband pulling on her, and she has all of these hands trying to do everything, but none of her hands are loving on her. And I just think it's so important to take care of yourself. If you take time off from work, don't tell everybody. Because if you do, they're going to want you to do things for them. So it's just simple things like that. But also loving yourself could mean going to therapy, taking time off to go to therapy or stopping, once at therapy before you go home from work. Having your therapy on your lunch break, if that's what it looks like. So really tailoring self-care to fit into like your day, whatever that looks like. Yeah. Mhm.
So before
Yeah.
we close, can you give 3 to 5 self-care tips?
Oh, yes. So I always say self-care. When we think self-care, we always think about going on trips, like manicure, pedicure, massages. So all of that, yes, that is fine. But also self-care can be setting boundaries. So, and it's not necessarily saying no, but self-care could look like not right now. Like, let me take care of me first, then I'll get back to you. So, all the mani pedis, traveling, massages, all of that, yes, in one, you can do that. But setting boundaries is self-care. Um, Anything in nature. So going outside can be a self-care routine. Anything in nature keeps us grounded. I would also say another really great self-care routine is it can be something as simple as first thing in the morning. Find you a nice podcast to listen to instead of the news. That's self-care because you're starting your day off in a positive way. Another form of self-care, excuse me, could be I love when I take my showers, I love shower steamers. So I would say throw
Hmm.
like a shower steamer in the shower. They are so like therapeutic.
What's a shower steam? Wait, talk
Oh,
about that. That's new
it's
to me.
like it's like a round little tablet. This isn't round, it's square, but it's like a round tablet that's white. And as soon as it hits the water, it begins to dissolve. But basically, what it's doing is it has like an aroma. Oh my gosh. There's so many fragrances, eucalyptus, lavender, rosemary, just all types of like fragrances. And you can create like your own little spot in your bathroom for like 15 minutes. Something that I just started doing is as soon as I get home, I actually get in the shower. So that was something that I did not, I had a very bad habit for years of just coming home, getting on my laptop, doing more work from the work that I just came from. Then I would call my parents. Then I would take my shower. Then I would eat. Because why? I was taking care of everybody else but myself. my parents had an expectation that I called them at a certain time. So what I started doing is when I get home, it's quiet. I take my shower, I put on my PJs, I eat, and then I call my parents, or I call my parents and then I eat. So it can be very small things that you do that don't even cost you a lot of money. And I always say start there. Yeah.
Okay.
Mhm.
Thank you so much, Tamara,
You're
for
welcome.
joining me today.
Thank
I know
you.
you're a busy woman and your knowledge is extensive. And I expect that it will help someone on their journey towards healing. This is the first time that I am doing this, and this is the first time that you're on the show, but I hope it will not be the last.
Don't want it to be.
Because this has been fantastic. One of you know me for some time, so one of my desires is to have a conference of this type with people like yourself who can come and help people heal. Because I think it's very important. Among women and especially among our Black community.
Definitely.
And I say this on the heels of the VP losing. I think
Mm,
I think because we are not united and we are not healed in some ways. I even had someone say, she's no savior. And it was another Black woman. And no, she's not a savior, but the fact that she was a Black woman who stood for something that we all could identify with. If nothing else, she stood for our rights to our own bodies. That alone, and not just for Black women, for women, period. So thank you. The healing is necessary, and I
mm.
believe this is the place to start. So thank you again
Uh,
for joining me today.
Thank you. So glad that I could be your first guest. So I got
Yes,
bragging
yes,
rights. I got bragging rights.
yes, yes, yes. And the next time, I promise you that I'll have the system set up a lot better.
It's fine. Hey, you're in a safe space. It's okay. Things happen.
Yes, yes.